Hey everyone, it's Mr. Wolf here, and in this video I'm going to be going over the guide. Okay, so what the guide is this is a helpful tool that you'll be able to use in order to complete a bunch of our modeling problems when it comes to biomolecules. So the reason why we have this packet is because what I really care about is that you guys could do this practice of using models. There's a lot of information and you don't need to know all of it, so it's helpful to have most of this information in just one spot for you guys to use for your reference, at least for the beginning practice. Okay. So the first page is just kind of giving you a little bit of information about the human body when we start to go into context with it. Because really quickly, let's talk about our question. How does glucose become all the other molecules life is made of? If we kind of look here, we have photosynthesis, and that's what we've been talking about. We make glucose. We know the plant's going to use that for structure, like the stem right here, and energy. But we eat plants as well, which means we're kind of eating glucose too. Right? Now, what the plant a plant is made up out of a lot of glucose, but it's not made up of all glucose, right? And once we eat it, we're not just, you are what you eat, but we're not all made out of glucose either, which means that somehow this glucose is changing in a way to make all the tissues of all the living things on Earth. So what's going on here? How does that happen? So that's why I'm showing you guys this picture of the human body, because we're going to talk about it in the context of us, what happens when we eat food. We're also going to be talking about it in the context of a plant, what happens once it makes that glucose in terms of building all of its structure and how it's actually going to accomplish that. And this page right here is just it's a helpful cheat sheet for you to kind of look at how we're going to model our biomolecules. So remember that video that you watched, or lesson where you watched me make our polymer of a carbohydrate, a polymer of a lipid, a fat, and a polymer of an amino acid. All right, so that was a little time consuming. It was really helpful because I think it gave us an idea of where the atoms are and how the atoms rearrange to make the molecules, but it gets a little cumbersome, right? So what I could do is, instead of just drawing a bunch of these C's, O's, and H's, for the purpose of the model that we're about to do, we could just kind of represent a monomer like this, right? Like that hexagon shape. And then if I have multiple together, well, then I just represent it like this. Right? And I noticed that just like we had the OH at the end here, I kind of have the OH at the end here. Now I have the H at the end here. I have the H at the end here. Okay. So similar type of thing with our fat. Okay. Instead of drawing this long fatty acid with all the C's, H's, and O's, I could just draw a triangle. That's it. Right? I still could put the OH at the end. Right? Same thing with the glycerol. Instead of drawing this guy right here, I could just draw a trapezoid. The H is on. That's it, right? It just makes it a lot more simple. And then here's my fat molecule once they all come together. Remember that the OHs and the H's, they didn't disappear. I don't have it in the model right now, but those would become water molecules on the side. Right. And then lastly, we have our protein. Okay. And so here are a bunch of my amino acids attached together. Here's a water molecule that got stuck to it. So just a second. Amino acid. All right. And so we could, instead of representing an amino acid as these complicated combination of atoms here, I could just simplify it and say that circle is going to represent an amino acid. I could still put the OHs and the H's at the end. And if I have a bunch of circles together, that's going to be my protein. Right? And we've done this before, but I think it also helps us. We'll model water as just H2O with the two H's next to it. All right, let's take a look at the last page. And this page is really, really, really helpful. Okay, so like I said, is that we know that all plants are going to make glucose, but what's going to happen to that glucose is it's going to become all of the other structures of the plant. So how does glucose end up doing that? Well, let's start with something simple maybe. Let's just start with glucose becoming a longer chain of glucose molecules. So here's glucose, and we're going to make carbohydrate over here. So you'll notice, does anything happen beforehand here? No. So I start off with my monosaccharide. So really all I'm doing here is I'm just redrawing my glucose molecule. So my glucose molecule is a monosaccharide. It just means that it's the building block of a carbohydrate. And if I have enough of these glucose molecules, right, they're going to attach and they're going to form together to make a polymer. So the specific word for a polymer that's a carbohydrate is a polysaccharide. Right? So I could get a glucose molecule. Those could just form a long chain of molecules. This could be starch, the stuff we eat in potatoes and corn. It could be the structure of a plant, like cellulose, which makes up wood and all that stuff. So this could become a lot of things that would become a part of a plant. But a plant's not all carbohydrates. It's also fats and it's also protein. So what goes down there? Well, we've talked about that the building blocks of fat are not glucose molecules. They're this glycerol molecule and these fatty acids. So how does that work with starting off with glucose? So what happens is, imagine that we have a bunch, let's say 4 glucose molecules. So I'm just going to draw 4 hexagons representing that. And what's going to happen is that once the cell makes the glucose, it actually starts breaking it down a little bit into its parts. Now, it didn't like blow it to smithereens where there's just atoms everywhere, but there's kind of like chunks of the glucose molecule like this. Right? And what these chunks could do is that they could rearrange. The atoms could rearrange in a way that makes glycerol. Because right? Glycerol is still made out of the same atoms, right? Carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. We can make a fatty acid. So let's label that. Glycerol, fatty acid, and then we're going to make 3 fatty acids from 3 different glucose molecules. And then we know that these are all going to come together to make a fat molecule. So let's say I'm a plant and I want to make some fat. Why do I want to make some fat? Maybe it's to make fat for a peanut, right, that we might end up eating. All right. Well, that fat actually started off as glucose that was made in photosynthesis. That glucose got broken down just a little bit, and those atoms were rearranged to make the monomers of fat, so glycerol and 3 fatty acids, and then those came together to make our fat molecule for a lipid. By the way, if it helps, maybe on the side here we'll write like carbs, lipids, and this is going to be protein over here. So how are proteins made then? Same thing's going to happen, is that glucose is going to be broken down just like our glucose was to make our fat monomers. Right? Now here's the interesting thing though, if I bring over our amino acid piece from the other day, or the other video, we have nitrogen. Right? If I look at glucose, or my glucose molecules chained together, there's no nitrogen here. So how does the plant get it? The plant gets nitrogen from minerals, right, containing nitrogen, and there's also, so not just nitrogen, but sulfur too, from the minerals in the soil. So the roots take those up. And so then you add some minerals to the mix, and you could get an amino acid. And then if you get a bunch of amino acids attached together, you get a protein. So remember, the whole point of this right here, I know it seems like a complicated diagram, but it shows how we could go from glucose that's made in photosynthesis, and how that glucose could either build up to make larger chains of molecules, or how it could kind of break down a little bit and then build back up to make all the molecules of all the structures of all life on Earth. Right? I think it's kind of cool. There's all these different crazy different living structures, but at the end of the day, we could just boil it down to something as simple as that. That's pretty neat.